Yeah, my pleasure. It's terrible. It couldn't be.
Good evening, everyone. I'm David Sproles, and I'm the president of the New York School of Interior Design, and it's truly my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. I have to let you know the number of visitors that we've had to the current exhibition that you just saw have been really, really impressive. And the number of RSVPs that we had to the opening that night was the largest we have ever had. So I think you all can agree that this was a pretty amazing show. I think most of you were there. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from all the designers tonight that did not get to speak in the gallery space. But before I hand the mic over, I just want to thank Donald and Tom for putting together such an extraordinary show and gathering together such an amazing group of architects and designers. So, thank you. And I should mention, the designers that we're going to hear from tonight include Mita Corsini Bland, Marshall Brown, John Gachot, Elizabeth Graziolo, Wendy Evans Joseph, Leyden Lewis, and David Netto. Now, those are in alpha order, so don't get confused about what I just and if you get something exciting out of this evening, which I think you will, please come back for another event we're having on March 26th, when we will be hosting another panel with other individuals who are associated with the exhibition. So look forward to seeing that roster, and I look forward to seeing you all on the 26th. So sit back and enjoy, and Donald and Tom, it's all yours. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you all for coming. And I just want to start with a thank you to Karen Poliski, who put this all together, and all of the audio-visual, and we are very grateful to all of that. Okay. I'm also impressed that there's so many of us. There are 9 of us. It's like a certain court down in Washington, D.C. But I thought that we would just jump right into it. And welcome to anyone who's joining us now. And I am going to pitch a question that I hope all of you will answer. But I'm going to start with John Gachot in the middle. And actually, if you don't mind, when you are responding to the first question, if you just want to say your name so that people who are just joining us will know who you are. And it's a broad and, I think, straightforward question, which is, when did you first begin to use computer software, such as AutoCAD? And do you remember some of your first impressions of its impact on your work? Because the whole, the central point of the show is that these drawings are being done very much by choice, in the sense that we are living in the computer age and in digital representation. And so we thought it would be interesting to start with, how did it first feel? When did it begin for you, and how did it first feel to have this other tool, this computer-assisted tool, at your disposal? So, John?
My name's John Gachot. It's an interesting question for me because I started out and am still a fine artist. So my background is in painting and drawing to begin with. And as I developed an interest in architecture and interiors as a profession, it became something that I had to learn. So all of my sketches beforehand had been in notebooks, and that was how I was formally trained. And I always worked out my ideas in drawing format. AutoCAD's great. I still remember, I don't do a lot of it now, but copy, clip, paste. I could take an image or an elevation or a plan and repeat over and over again. So it's a valuable tool, but it is a tool. It certainly doesn't replace any sort of skill that you have internally, but it is very handy. All the drawings that are in the show, I drew many times before I got to a final. Those were actually presentation drawings. So, having something to cut the time down, I think, is pretty incredible.
Mita, do you want to? Is your work related? Are you ever employing computer technology in your work, or is it never? So there you go. So we've got the full spectrum here, and I'm glad you're representing the pre-computer age. Proud representative. So.
Do you want me to speak? Or
yeah, well, if you want to address the question of why you don't use it, that might be interesting.
Well, I'm given projects sometimes from, for instance, I was given a project by a hotel group, and it's a computerized rendering, and I cannot tell if I'm looking at and it's a furnished room, and I can't tell. I said, I can't tell if I'm looking at leather or velvet, or I can't see the details. Can you give me more information? No information was coming forward. So I improvised, and then they come back and say, can you make it darker? What am I making darker? I mean, it was a very problematic project for me, because there was no information. You know, that's what I find very hard about a computer rendering, is you can't really see the textures. I mean, unless it's a really, really, really well done rendering. And I've gotten quite a few of these, and I've decided maybe I'm going to quit doing the projects for hotels that way, because it's frustrating. I'd much rather be given all the information about what's going into the room.
I was introduced to 2D drafting in AutoCAD in college when we were, when we were asked to step in. You know, I was literally in school in, 91, 92, 93. So that's when it was all starting to happen, and it was very intimidating to me. Actually, I'm still very much intimidated by the computer, and I feel like it's much more natural for me and organically to express myself through hand drawing, and then hope that, basically, I think so many of our clients have been trained with this kind of fidelity related to the 3D rendering, that I believe they believe that they understand the spaces that they're getting, and they're always really excited, when I produce a hand sketch,
Leyden, do you find that the younger people that you work with on your staff who knew this from the very beginning, knew about computer rendering from the beginning of their educations, is their approach to it very different from yours, in the sense that you started feeling intimidated by it and presumably they didn't?
Yeah, I think I think that the generation of people that come to work for me that are younger than I am, they tend to be intimidated by drawing.
Yes.
But what I find is that I spend, sometimes it depends on individuals. I don't want to make a generalization about an entire group of people, but what I've found is that with the overarching theme is that you don't understand what the height of that staircase really is like until you draw it by hand, right? Like, the relationship between the riser and the tread is something that I constantly have to understand, get into their heads about scale, proportion, use, and ergonomics, because of the departure and the distance between what your body's doing in a drawing and what and how you disassociate through, kind of drawing on the computer.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Marshall?
My name is Marshall Brown. I'm a practicing architect and a professor at Princeton University. I started using AutoCAD, I think it was release 12, when I was halfway through undergrad back in, it was probably 1993 or 94, so basically 30 years ago. I didn't use it to work in 2 dimensions because I was already very skilled, very trained at that point in terms of drawing and drafting by hand. I was using it primarily from the beginning to kind of sort out complex 3-dimensional problems, which was crazy because the simplest kind of 3-dimensional geometric operations would just make the computer crash over and over and over. I mean, it was just absolute folly. And so, that was my engagement with software for many years. It went from AutoCAD to other things, and then Revit came along, and et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of went on until about 2016, when I just stopped using software to do architectural design altogether. I quit, yes.
That's really fascinating. and besides the simple frustration of having it crash all the time, what went into that decision to abandon something that is so widely used? Or can you tell me more about what went into that?
It's 2 simple things. There's a lot of us up here, so I'll be brief. One is that it doesn't give me pleasure to sit in front of a computer all day doing like this. And it gives me more pleasure to do things by hand, which I'm sure many of us probably agree on that. And then 2, mistakes, and the wrong kind of mistakes. Not the kind of mistakes that we want, but the wrong kind of mistakes. I found that there were really sort of tragic errors that were occurring when I was using the software, things that I couldn't see that I would have seen if I had been working with a model or a physical model or a drawing.
Very interesting.
Me?
David? Yeah.
Okay, reboot that question for me. So, there's been so many good answers, I've forgotten what the question is.
So when did you first encounter computer-assisted rendering like AutoCAD, and what were some of your first impressions of it?
My first encounter of it, as I think I may have said when we were in the other room, was in the mid-90s, 1995. I went to architecture school, and CAD was taught, but CAD was not actually being really used. All your drawing was tubes and Mylar and trace and hand drawing in the trays, as the studios are called at that architecture school. And CAD was sort of coming. It was on the horizon. Everybody knew it was going to take over everything, but we had like 4 years before that completely changed the experience of what it meant to go to architecture school, which for me was chosen, as Marshall just said, because I enjoyed the experience of putting line on paper so much. I wanted to pencil in my hand. I had spent my whole life like that as an only child, and immersed in looking at modes of illustration like Tintin books, which are something called ligne claire, that's sort of flat, intentionally two-dimensional, but very rich form of illustration. And so if I had known when I was going to architecture school that I was signing up to sit in front of a computer, I wouldn't have chosen that job. I didn't want to spend all my time like that, typing keyboards. I wanted to be drawing. And then I escaped that because I couldn't do the math to pass structures and had to withdraw, which was very upsetting at the time. Why are you laughing? It was terrible. It was terrible. I was doing well in many ways, and then I just could not, that was not going to happen. So I became an interior designer, and then I never had to deal with CAD again until tonight. When,
We hope you're doing okay.
because I'm making everybody else do it, and they actually want what now only I can do, which is this crude sort of schmeary shadow casting that has the incredibly valuable effect of showing atmosphere, which makes clients like what they're about to be asked to spend all this money on. And CAD kind of does not ever do that. So my interface with it now is that I respect it. Once you've seen the efficiency of that, leveraging your drawings and not having to throw out entire sheets because you can change a little part of it with 2 clicks. That's totally worth its salt in terms of its role and importance in the profession. But I personally would not choose to sit and type because I also don't know what I want to do until I'm drawing. There's something about the inefficiency of drawing and the mistakes you make and bump up against. Maybe everybody is nodding down there because you agree with this. Yeah. That tells you exactly what you do want to do. And when I make a mistake with a pencil, I can, what do I want this to be? Make a little mess, and then And CAD has never, ever given me that opportunity, the sense that I was really seeing around corners.
There's a lack of perfection, too, that you can edit and focus on things without having to complete the picture, right? I mean,
I find that the illusion of perfection and the value that implies is my enemy.
Yeah.
That CAD makes everything so perfect that you don't finish thinking what you might have been thinking if you were struggling with it.
Well, it's one of those things showing CAD plans too, or even elevations, can ruin the spell of a project.
Yeah.
Because people start seeing things too clearly that are actually not really well thought through, and it's just a series of lines.
Well, I'm sure to some extent becomes problem solving rather than exploration, design, and grappling with it, because you just want to. If it looks good enough, and CAD makes a lot of things look good that might or might not be that good, you can just move on. And I do wonder, I'm talking too much again, but I wondered it at the time how this would change design in the world, using a completely different mode of production to make the drawings? How is that actually going to change the forms of the buildings? And I would love it if you wanted to. I'm not here to ask questions, but
Why don't we just finish
at some point, tell me if you think that's happened or not, in any way that's manifest.
Well, I'd actually love to hear that from all of you. But why don't we just finish this question, and then I would love to hear, do you think that the means of representation and the universal adoption of the computer programs has changed the actual process of form making? Are the forms different? Do buildings and interiors look different because of the means of production? But just before we address that, Wendy, do you want to talk about when you first encountered it and what some of your first impressions were?
Maybe. The thing
You don't
that
have
I'm
to.
hearing,
No pressure.
No, the thing that I'm hearing is that so far all of us just have the pleasure of drawing. That just, it's such a pleasurable thing to do, and it's part of who we are, is that creative idea of just pencil on paper or paintbrush or whatever. And that's part of who we are. Now, architecture is partially that artistic sense. It's also the math. And so I, at least, always sort of kind of back and forth between that notion of technology and what it takes to actually build things, the sort of toughness of that, and couple that with the artistic part. And I would just say that for me, I always drew and loved to pick out a perspective and all of that. When AutoCAD first came in, and I'm looking at Michael at the pay office, they had like a special room that was super air conditioned, and very few, only like 3 or 4 people were allowed to be in that room, and they got to learn AutoCAD.
Yeah.
And that was, so
There was
I
also MicroStation.
I don't know what it was. I don't even know what it was.
That might have pulled ahead of AutoCAD.
I don't know. Whatever they were doing in there, they were doing it. And then I would go in there, and I'd say, let's look at this perspective from this point of view, and they could generate the underlay for the line drawings, and then that would allow me to design on top of them. So I guess the thing that I've enjoyed about it, and I personally don't know how to do any computer, any of the computer programs whatsoever myself, but what I like about it is that I'm able to sort of have parts of it generated in the computer that serve as a kind of literal and metaphoric underlay for working out ideas. And so that for me has been very successful, and continue to do that in a way that even will render spaces in light and shade, and then I'll come in pencil and we can overlay those on top of the drawings so they become these collages that, in a way. So that's where I'm going there, to answer your question.
Liz?
Yay, it's me. I loved it. I was like just out of school. I just really, really enjoy. No, I think I'm here. Yeah. Yeah, I'm someone who really loved to explore new technology. Like right now, I'm in love with ChatGPT. But back then, in the late 19, like many of us said, it's a tool. And I remember I was very excited to hear about CAD, and then actually went on my own to learn it. My firm at the time, I just got out of college. They were not really using it. I really wanted to learn it because I was just curious about it. I mean, as an architect, I do explore both the artistic point of view and also the technical point of view. And to me, CAD was just like that new tools that was so exciting. And I took it upon myself not only to learn 2D, 3D CAD, and I spent a lot of time mastering, trying to make it mimic hand drawings, which is almost like impossible, right? But I think I got it really, really close, and I became an expert in my company, the firm I was working at the time. But again, it's a tool. It did not replace hand drawings to me, and I very much still love to explore, design by hand. But I thought it was an excellent tool. It took a long time for it to mimic. Well, for me, I was trying to make it mimic a beautiful drawing, which really you never really get there, but you get close. And the best part of it was the fact that you can really undo, and redo very quickly. So I admire CAD for what it's worth. It's like everything. For me, it's like there's pros and cons into everything we encounter in life. And I kind of like focus on the pros of cons. And then later on, Revit came. That one, I almost want to give up on that one. But it's because I'm not really in it. So I had a great experience in terms of like learning CAD and using it as a tool. The challenge was, for me, was like to actually teach it to the young people, because they'll come to me like, well, this is how CAD does it. I'm like, who's teaching who? Is CAD teaching you, or you using it as a tool? So I think if people, well, to me, it's like if you kind of like just retrain your brain to understand, this is just like a tool that can make part of your work easier. It doesn't really need to replace what I was doing by hand.
So I thought we would ask about precedent. Yeah. And are there any interior designers or architects currently working or from the past who have not only maybe inspired you, but whose work you aspire towards, or that you like, that you love? I mean, other than Paul Rudolph, of course.
Right. He was pretty talented, though.
Oh my God, yes.
I'd say my grandfather was an architect, and he had some Piranesi's that I fell in love with, and that to me was this blend of like technical skill and fantasy. So like the ability to take something that is so well drawn and have character and fantasy and give me a sense of emotion out of that was really important. To the other, Winsor McKay, who did the Little Nemo comics, is just like his sense of perspective and that turn of the century architecture, Beaux-Arts architecture that's just blown up and on steroids was just incredible. I guess Christo is another one. I think is just an amazing draftsperson, and his architectural renderings of covered devices is beautiful.
Yeah. What about others?
Walter Gay, I love his atmospheric renderings. It might be a room with just a little bit of a breeze coming in and a chair, and you fall in love. It's just wonderful. So that's, for me, for instance, my own renderings are very much about capturing that light, that moment that you feel somebody's just stepped out of the room. They're very much more paintings than renderings, although I get a lot of commissions right now that have more to do with. But I think Jeremiah Goodman is another one. I love the way he works. I mean, there's something really quite magical about his method.
Well, if you look at the one we have in the show, he's, a squiggle, you see it as a drape. You just see it as drapery. He's able to do the most minimal marking, and you know what it is.
I like that. I like that comment a lot. And I think that ability to make like a likeness of a place, that you still know what it is and the feeling of it. I personally look more at artist drawings than necessarily architect drawings, like Gaudi and Claude Lorraine, like their sketchbooks and travel sketchbooks, where they're actually looking at architecture and sort of getting that sense of light and place.
I'm definitely influenced by the Gordon Matta Clark. The photography of Gordon Matta Clark, I think, was very impressionable to me as an artist and architect in performance art. So, and also. I was just actually giving a presentation yesterday for a thesis, and I was reminded that I had to do a little homework. And Dylan Scafidio, speaking to Wendy's comment about collaging, I love their presentations because they're both using technology and then superimposing these hand drawings in section. So they're dense, right? They're not, hand drawing is not the enemy of AutoCAD, to Liz's point, and technology is not the enemy of, vice versa. So there's all this there's these new things that can come out of, the integration of technology and the hand drawing and collaging together.
Yeah, there's a beautiful Mies van der Rohe collage where he has drawn a convention center which becomes McCormick Place in Chicago. and it's very crisp and beautiful, and then he's bought this cheap American flag, and he's glued it on. So it's not just color and black and white, vernacular and mise. It's the simplest thing, but it's really powerful. Speaking of collage.
Yeah.
I think the Barcelona Pavilion drawing too has that, right? Where there's the
Yes.
Malwa sculpture like floating in the water or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's just so powerful to have that little cutout.
He loved Maillot because there's a kind of a mass and a volume, whereas his architecture is kind of linear and planar. He loved the muscular a lot, so he'd cut out those and glue them on.
Influences that are in my head all the time, I'm going to give you two. One is somebody now, and it's a guy called Andrea Melloni, who's getting a lot of attention, and he's very much in favor and published, Studio Melloni. And he came to my attention when he did the renovation of a lobby for a bank within Rockefeller Center. And it was this extremely calibrated, respectful take on the architecture of Raymond Hood and the point of view and DNA of Donald Desky and American Art Deco that building was all about. But he added a future to that language. It was not a stage set of those past elements. And the other, so he's doing that. I've noticed he's doing that with furniture a lot. He goes to UN Plaza, and suddenly he's using modern pieces that aren't from the 30s, that are from the 70s. And I think he's very, very serious about a strong point of view. And so I think the discipline of that is something that I envy and wish. I'm sort of an irreverent decorator. I wish I could be as precise and literate and intelligent as his designing is to me. And then somebody from the past who I love would be Cedric Gibbons, set designer. It's not a real architect at all, but he had more power than maybe any architect because celluloid was the world to so many people. More people saw the movies in the 30s than ever saw actual buildings. So it was incredibly influential. And if you look at his sets for futuristic architectural elements, like at the movie Lost Horizon from 1938, he was really like Frank Lloyd Wright in some ways, but because he was able to collage from everybody. I think when he designed sets and the whole thing would be torn down, after shooting, you didn't have to make it practical. You could commit to nothing, like as at a World's Fair.
Well, especially when they depicted New York, because they
Yes.
were 3,000 miles away.
Yes.
It was far more imaginary.
There's usually an establishing shot of the financial district,
Right.
which always shows Eli Jacques Kahn's ziggurat building at the foot of Wall Street, which is incredibly visible and recognizable at that time. And then it's a fantasy of matte painted stuff and built doorways, but then the building is fake. It's a painting. So that fantasy, but meant to represent real cities is something that I sort of walk around with in my head too.
Well, somebody from the past that very much influenced is an architect. It's a French architect called Henri Labrousse. They actually had an exhibition on him, I think maybe like 8 or 10 years ago here in the U.S. at the Museum of Modern at MoMA. Yeah, and he came to mind because I just remember studying the way he studied or he looked at architecture, which is very inspiring to me. For his time, he was like studying traditional architecture, and then he was like actually studying the new material of that era, which was like cast iron, developing very slender column. He did the Bibliothèque Nationale in Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris. And so they did a renovation of that library, and I just recently saw it in Paris. It's very much modern to this day than it was back when he first, it's just like the idea of like,
It's a frame and panels.
it's
frame and panels.
yes, it's just,
amazing.
it's just,
How modern it is.
it's amazing how modern it is. And this is something that was built like over 100 years ago, 100 to 200 years ago. So, yeah.
So the drawing, the big drawing I have out in the gallery, what's it called? Elements of an American House or something like that, is actually a direct homage of an exploded oblique drawing of a Usonian house by Frank Lloyd Wright. I taught and worked in Chicago for 10 years. So that's certainly an influence in my teaching, my own current design work. I look a lot at the drawing and design work of Carlos Scarpa, you know, thinking about architecture as an art of joining always. And then finally, I had the privilege of studying, actually taking the last studio that Enrique Miralles ever taught at Harvard before he passed away. And I've always been very interested in the work that he did with Carmen Pinos back in the 1980s and early 90s. And only very recently, this is like my bibliographic reference, especially for the students, only very recently has there been a really in-depth book about their drawing technique. It's called the Miralles Projection. I highly recommend it. And because those drawings have, you know, really baffled a lot of people for a long time, and I think it's quite informative how it actually gets into the way that the drawings were made and the way that the making of the drawings produce certain spatial complexities and possibilities. So it points directly to this notion that, you know, between thought and the artifact, there is the medium, and that route goes both ways, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that also points to this thing that I actually like to push back again, this notion that, you know, something can be just a tool. I think that's been said a couple of times. I think we have to be very wary of that kind of dismissal because, you know, the way that drawing exists on the path between thought and things, you know, and that path goes both ways, so does software in our process. And so I think there are things that are happening to the mind when you choose different medium. Right? The same way there are things that are happening to the project.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the medium or the media that you use. Pen, pencil, watercolor. What do you prefer? Wendy mentioned, I think, in the gallery, the sort of feel of the pencil on the paper. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you use and why you use it. Pen, pencil, watercolor.
I use pencil, sometimes charcoal, sometimes I love monochromatic watercolor I love neutral tint with a little bit of, and my color is cerulean. I love the combination of those two colors. For me, that's warm and cool, and I do a lot of work with that. But it's Winsor & Newton watercolor, really. And I'm beginning to use a little bit of gouache because it covers certain areas better. But I love the nuance of watercolor. And I use a little bit of pen, but mostly pencil.
Mm-hmm. Everything.
Erase?
Sorry?
If you're using pencil, do you ever erase?
Oh, yes. Yes, because it's architectural. The line goes off, or I do correct it.
Yellow trace, clear trace, copy paper, legal paper. Yeah, and so I had this presentation class back in the 90s, and I just fixated on it. And this one person, I can't remember it's bad that I don't remember instructor's name, but he just showed me how, and I thought it was like completely magical. Like you can use marker on both sides of the trace, right? And that just blew my mind. It blew my mind. Like, you know, you could just make this kind of flat surface and then it could read on one side, and then you could use pencil. So it's definitely multimedia, like color pencil on a trace, on a white trace, everything. So it's all available. It's one of those mediums where I don't feel like I have too much agency over like the liquidity of paint. It's never been something that I've gravitated towards. So I do feel like I have a certain amount of control between pencil, marker, and pen.
Similarly, I tend to use dry media more because I also prefer the control. Wet media has never been my best friend. Although I do have a fantasy about learning to use gouache, actually. So that caught my ear. So yeah, and then we all probably use a lot of the same things, but one of the kinds of paper that I like to use, which I'm afraid soon I won't be able to buy anywhere, is there's this. It's like it's a coated vellum. Denryl was the brand, and now I think they've gone out of business. There are a couple of companies that make it. Those drawings out there are made on coated vinyl. It's not the same thing as Mylar, and I love it because I can draw and redraw, and you can really beat on it, right? And it doesn't wrinkle as much as regular vellum, and that works for me because I don't really make presentation drawings. I just make working drawings and then present them.
I'd say one thing when I draw, I tend to have a little intimidation by like a really crispy, beautiful sheet of like $10 paper. So I draw mostly in the morning. I get up before my family and I'll take whatever medium is around. If it's a piece of newspaper, if it's a scrap of paper, or some drawing that I completely obliterated and tear off a piece of that. And I find that my pencil keeps going, or my brush dips in my coffee, or the leftover cocktail from the night before, and I'm using all sorts of things. And I think that sort of undervaluing the medium and kind of letting the expression of it get on paper and playing with that and learning it is helpful. So trying not to ever fall into a crutch of one particular pen, pencil, paper. I love them all. It's kind of what's available, so that I have kind of challenge myself a little bit and see if I can get whatever's in my head down on that whatever scrap I have lying around. And those tend to be my favorite things.
I take the recycled paper from like junk faxes and computer stuff that you aren't going to use, turn it over to the clean side, so a stack of that, and then I use Flair Papermate black felt tip pens when I want a thick line, and then I use it's not a rapidograph, but those really razor ballpoint, precise pens. I have one in my pocket right now. So a drawing comes to life when you have two line weights, and then there's my thick one, there's my thin one. Then pencil for shading, a Schmiery pencil, softer than a number 2, and then the secret technique that is really helpful is somebody taught me to make the effect of a framed mirror on the wall where it's dark up in one corner and getting light in the other. You smear it with the pencil directly in one corner and then take your greasy fingers and mash it around, but you have to keep the edges very clean. So you put paper at the frame and do that and smear it. And then the most important tool I use is a series of light gray highlighters that create the effect of watercolor and can represent shadow, which are if you like anything about my incredibly lame drawings in there, the shadow casting comes from those highlighters, and I use probably 4 degrees of darkness for them. Maybe 2 per drawing, but spread across a range of, there are dozens of them, but you really only need 3. And you? What are you going to do tonight when you get home?
I like those General's drafting pencils, and that's all I use.
Oh, sorry. I use only the General's drafting pencils and Bristol paper, which is super, super, super smooth. And I like playing with the pencil line on the paper and digging in and pulling out, kind of like you might with a brush. And I also like these stomps that are rolled, and you can smush the line as well to make shade and shadow. And I kind of play back and forth, but I never erase. I'm always curious with people who use pencil because I think of it as a pen. And then the other thing I was curious with everyone else too is when I make a drawing, sometimes it's like travel sketches even, we're not talking about that tonight, but always drawing things. When it's done, and that's it. And the worst is even the temptation to go back later. It has to all be done for me in one sitting, and that's it. I don't ever go back because there's just a moment that you seize, and then that's it.
For me, I pretty much like them all as well, but it depends on what I'm thinking about. So for example, at the onset of a project, just for my thinking process, I wake up at 5 a.m., I have like a piece of white trace, and I use a black marker because you just give me the freedom of not being too precise. It's just like a thought, a process, just to be able to kind of like figure out, just like get an overall global understanding of what I'm trying to think about. And then I can move on into pencils later once I show the sketches to my team, and they're like, Liz, this doesn't work. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, the wall, you have to counter for the wall. I'm like, it's a sketch. And then I'll eventually move on to a pencil and trace. So I think if I had to pick a media, I would say trace is really kind of like my favorite thing. Yellow trace, white trace, and also when we're having meetings with clients, when we actually have a drawing printed on and we actually have one-on-one meeting with clients, it's so much easier to have a pencil because you can quickly draw something, you erase it. So that's why I like the flexibility of a pencil. But COVID changed a lot of this because we ended up having a lot of, at least for me as an architect, and I do a lot of presentation drawing, and you are presenting virtually to the clients, and that's really, really tough, right? Because you kind of lost that flexibility of quickly sketching something on the screen for them. So I kind of moved on into a tablet in order to do that, and the pencil, which kind of like, on screen, it still conveys and gives you that freedom, but you kind of don't have that same control. So
speaking of 5 a.m.,
yeah.
Stanford White used to pass out in the Madison Square Garden Tower where he entertained, and an office boy was sent from McKim, Mead & White at 5 a.m. every morning to gather up all the crumpled up trace around, strewn around the office that was a total mess. And this stuff would then be taken to the studio and interpreted by drafts people who were at that time so well trained in the classical language that they could understand what he meant. But this is after everybody's left, 3, 4 a.m., drunk, drawing. So if we can have Stanford White on this panel, he would say trace and whiskey or something, and probably a charcoal. I mean, he probably didn't even have a mechanical pencil.
Yeah,
and that's what gave us all these.
I have a kind of confession to make. I used to be an architect, and when the dinosaurs walked the earth. And I worked in Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in Chicago in the 70s. And if you think Mylar is difficult, I don't know who invented this. They would take linen sheets, literally linen, which was plasticized, and you would draw on it in ink. And if you made a mistake and you went to erase it, at some point, you'd go through the plastic and the ink would blot out. You had to get a razor out and you had to scrape it off. It was antediluvian. I don't know what they were thinking. That was my material I did not want to use.
The emulsion, it was like an emulsion on the Mylar that would go away and then you're doomed.
Yeah, right.
I'd actually like to go back to a point that you made, Marshall, about the trajectory from an idea, and correct me if I'm not describing this correctly, but a trajectory from an idea to a drawing to an object, and that it goes both ways, that there's that the choice of medium is not simply a tool, that it affects the way that you think, is what I was getting from what you were saying, and please fill in. But I wonder how everyone feels about that. In other words, what are the implications of the choice of medium on your thought process, not simply on what it looks like? And one of the things that occurs to me is the issue of speed. And that Hippocrates famously said, life is short, art is long. And that is widely taken to mean that art will outlive us all. But there are people who interpret that differently, and they interpret it as life is short and art is long in the making. That it takes patience to be an artist or an architect, or even a photographer. That, you know, the photographic image is created like this, but the search for the imagery is slow. And there's this contradiction in photography. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about that in terms of architecture. Is the speed at which you think different depending on what medium you're using?
Should I speak first? I did a project with my husband years ago, and he has a very descriptive way of seeing something. And I was following him, not quite getting what he was getting at. So I started sketching what he was saying. And in my mind, that's how I understood what he was talking about. A few months later, we went back to Italy to see the project. And I was frustrated. And he said, "Why are you frustrated?" And I said, "Because it's changed completely." And he said, "No, it hasn't." And he produced a sketch, and he said, "Look, it's exactly what you drew. Here it is." And it was a moment of great. So I think sometimes I get that really quick interpretation of what somebody's saying and draw it all out, and it's crystal clear and it doesn't change. And when people ask me to do renderings, very often it's exactly that. I sit with them and I see what they're talking about, and I go home and just sketch it all out. So for me, it's very immediate. It's very quick.
Yeah, really interesting.
I'd say that Christine and I have a pretty big studio, and so we're not individually doing all the work anymore, and we have to delegate. And I think that you choose skill sets and mediums based on the clients and the reaction to the mediums that you're presenting and how you're doing it. We had a meeting recently where we showed a computer rendering, God forbid, to a client for a hotel, and they just were like, "I hate it. I hate it, I hate it, I hate it." And we went back and grabbed some of my sketches that the renderings were based upon and popped those down on a page. And I added some color and shadow and went through, and he's like, "My God, why didn't you show this to me first? This is great." And I think that you have to be able to read the audience a little bit, and that there has to be a little bit of interpretation, and what you leave out of the drawings is as important as what you put in. And so, you know, focusing on areas that you think are important that might be setting a rhythm or tone, and those choices really are important. And graphic computer rendering tend to have too much information. And it's, in as much as you can instantly generate something, it often is lacking so much. And I think your eye tends to notice a lot of what's missing or wrong in drawings when you see, or in presentation materials, when you have too much information. So you can be a really good editor when you draw. You can eliminate elements that haven't been fully thought through, but get to the heart of whatever that particular project or portion of a project need to be captured.
Yeah, interesting.
I think I'm going to answer the question a little bit like from a point of view, personally, from like this idea of signature. I grew up where I was taught, cursive writing, and and really, I even noticed today that everybody, many people, not everybody, a lot of people just do this kind of like zoop, when they sign their names now. And I grew up like I was very much fascinated with my L and my E and my Y, and all this stuff. And so what dawned on me while we were talking about it like tool, this idea of the technology is not as a passive tool, but that if I go around my class, I can't tell, student 1's drawing on a computer, and I can't differentiate that from student 7. And I think that is a part of maybe a psychological and possibly an emotional departure from the connection with the work, maybe. And I don't know. I mean, you're positing this really profound question, and it might be a departure because there's no signature, there's no idiosyncratic ownership to that. You know, as long as you select the right line weight in CAD that everyone else has done, your drawings will be produced fairly in the same way, right? If you're drawing the same thing. So signature and individual, the idea of, we saw today in that tour, and I was glad I was able to catch it. It's just like, look at the magic that comes from all of the idiosyncratic minds and the way they're telling a story. And I think that that certainly changes. And I think it actually buttresses right up why we have so many students like, here's my Pinterest board, or like I'm taking all these other people's stuff to merge with the anonymous AutoCAD drawing. You know what I mean? So it's an interesting conversation and topic, yeah.
I mean, if I could just follow up with that, one thing I think that's really interesting is that it's not just the drawings that you produce, it's also how you lay them out on a sheet. Essentially drawings are instruction manuals for someone, right? Here's my idea. I'm gonna give you this and I want you to illustrate and build this and to ask questions. And where I see the signature amongst designers in my studio is the way that they present those drawings, right? You can do a section through a flat wall and it looks like an L and you're like, why did you draw that? Like, what am I getting at that? But then you have people that are taking blow-ups of full-scale crown molding and they're extrapolating it from a portion of an elevation, and you get this whole thing, and on one sheet of paper, you've got your plan, you've got all your details, and you're like, my God, I mean, it's genius. And you look at the drawings of like David Adler or sort of these early 20th century architect, designer, interior architects, there's so much juicy information in there. And the technique is the same, but it's really about how you present and lay it out on the page that, it's like, aha, I get it. I don't have to flip to the 600 series and look at this little detail, or flip back to my RCP, and it's all there. And I think that is really fascinating, and it's kind of a lost art unto itself.
Yeah, really interesting. Marshall, do you want to share any of your thoughts, since I was using your thought as a jumping off point?
Sorry, I was, this is not the conversation I thought we were going to have, because I was getting a little weirded out because when I first started teaching, now almost 20 years ago, I taught a seminar about this conversation we're having right now. It was called Forgetting Drawing, the Architect's Hand After Digital Media. I taught the seminar for a few years, and then I talked about all this stuff at conferences like speed or medium of risk or media affordances and all these things, and no one cared. Like, no one cared. To the point where I just stopped teaching the class, stopped writing about it. I just absorbed all this thinking into my own work, and it eventually led to me just like not using software anymore. I picked a side, in the end. I picked a side because I had spent my time looking at the situation, and I got so troubled by it that I realized, okay, we have a problem here. And it's very curious to me that we're here tonight, that this show is going on. There are other shows going on right now about, the same questions. There's the Paul Rudolph exhibition over at the Met and all these books coming out. And I wonder if there's some kind of crisis brewing finally, some kind of overdue crisis brewing. It's been 30 years, since the 90s, and all these machines showed up, even though they had been lurking in the background since the 60s. And I think what happened was that, and we're supposed to be talking about hand drawing, right? Not the computer so much, but it's somehow the boogie, the like weird ghost in the room. But I think there was something that happened. What bothers me about the conversation is that we talk about these things as though there's some invisible hand, right? These things just happen to us. But these are choices that people made to invest in you know, the equipment and the machines and the software. And when these choices were made for many of us, the people who were making the choices did not know what they were doing. But now suddenly the people on the stage, we all know, right? We all know how to use the machines, most of us. You know what I'm saying? Is it some generational thing or something? I'm going off track. But the question about speed and thought, I think these are all the right questions, because we've been working on assumptions, and I think it's interesting now that we're starting to question these assumptions and perhaps trying to, not even in a nostalgic way, but trying to recover some things that maybe we left on the side of the road. And it's interesting to me to think about, well, why is this all suddenly happening now? And of course, there are other technological transformations which are not on the horizon, which we're suddenly confronted with. And so maybe there's something subconscious going on.
Okay, well, with
Sorry.
no. It's fascinating. With that, I think we'd like to open things up to any questions. You can use that as a jumping off point or anything else that occurs to you. And so I think someone is going to hand you a mic.
Okay, there's somebody in the last row.
Hi, thank you so much for all these incredibly thoughtful comments. I've just been thinking about two things over and over again as you've been speaking, and it's related to what you were just saying, this last comment of what is happening and where is it coming from. And that I worked in advertising prior to working in interior design, and in the early 90s, there was a book that came out called Where the Suckers Moon. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's Randall Rothenberg who wrote it. And it's about a famous advertising pitch for Subaru during the recession. And there's, I think, 6 agencies pitching it. And everybody, you know, has their presentation that's buttoned up and PowerPoint. And they've been rehearsing it all night. And then this new young agency comes in, Wyden and Kennedy, and they do the entire presentation on a flip chart, and they're just drawing it as the meeting is progressing. So they're able to, as we've all been talking about, keep it very loose so the client doesn't fixate on, I don't like that color, I don't like that font. And then if they feel the room is going in a certain direction, when they draw the next drawing, they can adapt. So what we're talking about that is related to design and architecture is in other industries as well. And I'm wondering what's happening in other industries if people are looking at those techniques where you actually are doing something by hand and re-seeing value in it. And then the other thing I just wanted to say was I keep thinking about David Hockney, who painted his whole life, and then, you know, in his 80s or 90s has started using a tablet, like you were saying, and where you can erase and go back, but you can also have, do you think you can have the feeling that you have by drawing, or is it a viable hybrid for anybody?
Can I answer your question with a question?
Yeah, I don't even know what my question was.
I know, it was, well, before I forget what I want to say, can you explain the pleasure that you experience watching an old Ray Harryhausen stop-motion animation movie or a Godzilla movie versus this totally CGI virtuoso representation of science fiction movies today? Well, I cannot put that to words, but I know that I prefer to watch Clash of the Titans any day over Marvel, you know, bioengineered shit, these fancy movies that our kids grow up on. And I think that's along the lines of what you're asking. Has it affected other industries? It's affected cinema enormously.
Yes.
And the prettier it gets, the more vacuous it gets.
And music.
In that instance. Probably, yes. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah. If you compare hip-hop music today versus the mid-'90s, it's completely, I mean, this is not my area of expertise exactly, but I remember liking it a lot more until it became this stripped down, very mechanical, computer generated, you know, drum beat thing versus Biggie or what it once was.
I think it's definitely something that anecdote makes me think about something I've been meditating on, which is how you reward attention. And there's a difference between a demonstration and a presentation. What you're describing, this kind of drawing in real time on a flip chart, right? That's a demonstration, right? It's a performance. And in some ways, I think that kind of communication or storytelling rewards people for being there in the way that a PowerPoint does not, right? Because the PowerPoint is something they could have watched at home, looked at home on their living room or in their office or something like that. And I think also many of the drawings in the gallery, that is also what happens. Even though we're not drawing them live, there's evidence that we did. You can almost imagine us doing it, and it rewards you for being there in the room with it. As you get closer and farther away, it rewards your attention. So I think that is part of what's happening in there.
It's also what you're rendering too, right? It's easier to draw a lot of scroll work in a canvas and columns and have it look juicy and textured and balanced. But like if you're drawing a perfect minimalist steel cube, it's pretty hard to draw, right? Like it's kind of hard to convey that simplicity or the complexity of how simple things can be. And I find that as a culture, our work explores modernism and contemporary detail and the elimination of joinery and all these things that really make life easier, it gets really hard to render, right? To draw, right? We're applied artists. We're not, whatever. I'm an applied artist, right? I have a product that I'm trying to produce or make. And I think that, how you approach that, you have to think of what the final goal is. So yeah, it's easier to do a 3D rendering on a computer of like a perfect cube or something like that than to hand draw. And it may be, at the end of the day, it's only as good as the viewer who is saying, oh, I get it, right? And the guys who are looking at the flip chart were relieved to look at that after seeing 16 PowerPoint presentations. Like, oh, this is refreshing, right? So
it's intimate.
Yeah.
The more you put in of yourself into something, the more people will respond to that.
I see two questions, one in the back and one on the side, and I want to make sure that we get to both of them. And then
I appreciated the school president sharing with us the tremendous success of the exhibition. And I assume personally in part that's in part because there are people coming like myself who are neither architects nor interior designers nor have any hope to become that, but because of analogous changes in our own industries are compelled here because we hope that we'll glean something in the particularity of what you're doing that we can take home with us and apply to our own thinking as we try to grapple in our work and in our private lives with the momentous changes that have already taken place and are clearly afoot in our culture. You need to look no further than the front row at the inauguration to know that AI is coming, right? It's already here, and we don't get a choice any more than you did with CAD. You can make a choice, but it's coming into your industry whether you liked it or not, right? So what I wanted to invite you all to think anecdotally with particular moments in your work that resonated with you into the way that you live. And share those with us so that we can steal them and take them home with us. Thank you. Anyone, like, where you were working or thinking and you went, wait a minute, and then you went home and you started to live differently or work in the macro differently, some kind of small thing, or you can answer any way you want, obviously, just spin it, go ahead.
I kind of, my partner and wife, we're a team, and so we live and work together, and that sort of gray area has just merged into one big life, and I think that we treat a lot of what we do for interior and architectural design. We're always sort of moving things around. I mean, a typical weekend is moving furniture around in the living room or sizing things out and being like, oh, we could have made this better or bigger. And so I enjoy it. It gives me great pleasure to do that, to have that conversation and to look and see. It's the reason why I got into interior design. I'm an artist. I love sculpture and design and all these things that come together, and being able to execute and play and do that and not take it so seriously. It's a pleasure. I'm very lucky, I feel like, to do what I do.
I feel like I learn a lot from hotels. When I go somewhere that someone doesn't have to actually live, I get ideas that was that your question? What do you do that changes your life and you take it home and something's different? When I travel a lot for work, which is a lot, I stay in hotels and I make a point of never staying in the same hotel because I want to experience different ones. And so I went to 5 Orchard or 9 Orchard downtown, which is really recessed lights in. So if you pound the pavement and you go look at things that are built for temporary amusement, you can take some of that sexiness and put it in somebody's house, maybe your house.
I go to the same hotel every time. And the same
What
room,
hotel is that?
And the same room. But for me,
You have to hold your.
I like the part when you can kind of lose yourself in the place. And so if I go to Venice, I draw San Giorgio from this same cafe right on the Giudecca area, and I draw it at the same time every time I go, every year, for years and years and years. And it's the same, but it's not the same. And I just lose myself in that and the thinking of that. And partially it's San Giorgio, and then partially it's somewhere else at the same time. But that ability to sort of lose yourself and be alone in your thoughts and just what you're seeing, for me, is the greatest pleasure, and the thing that informs every other part of my creative life.
That's a good side. Or you kind of like see everything that's wrong when you go places because your eyes are so well trained. Sometimes I find myself, like David, I travel a lot, because I think that's my outlet of feeling inspired and also to just stop thinking. Or just kind of let yourself lose yourself and be able to see something you haven't seen before, or actually look at something and interpret it a different way in your work. So I feel like our brains as designers, we're always working. It's always there. So I don't think I have a very different personal life than work. I feel they kind of merge together.
Oh, you can't drop out now. You were really into it at one point.
There was a moment that I was pretty.
And there's that microphone. Where's that moment now?
Go for it. It's gone.
Hi, how's it going? I wanted to ask, I guess, what do you think would be what do you think it would take in order for something like CAD or any of those other softwares to really become more of an artistic tool as opposed to something that's just mathematical and we got to get this building on the page and ship it out and whatnot? What could make it, what do you think would make something so industrial, more life-like, or something have more life in it? I don't know.
You mean technical?
Yeah.
I think there's been extraordinary architects and designers and artists and designers that have used technology to produce exquisite, sexy drawings, mapping drawings, and things like that. So I think it's one's idiosyncratic personal engagement with a medium, always. But I did want to just also respond to that. I'm just going to say, because I think that the counter to whatever may be happening or not happening, or if it's a conspiracy or whatever, is that I think what I'm personally very much interested in is emotionality and my emotional sobriety right now, around the things that make me feel and make me understand about staying in touch with how I feel in order to produce, maybe I can make a drawing that conveys that feeling, or I can attempt to do that. I think that's what we all are doing in whatever medium, whether it is the tool or whether it is the paintbrush or whether it is the pencil. I think the intention to translate how we feel, how I feel, and possibly parse that on, pass that on to someone else. I think that is always my personal intention. So I think that intentionality is something that I think could be, is a way of addressing that question or that statement.
Can I say at the bottom of all of this, it seems to me that there is a very strong emotional element in drawing, and I encourage everybody to try because it's when you start with that pencil and just go. And one of my favorite exercises I tell kids is take a brush, dip it in water, put it in paint, and just see the effect on paper. And it's just it's remarkable. And you can play with that water and control it, and put some pencil afterwards, and just make a mess. And it's just wonderful. But I think there is an emotional element in the process of drawing, of pursuing that idea, that inspiration.
Very personal, though. I took a watercolor class. I was so impatient with it. It just wasn't for me. But I appreciate. But there was people in the class who were so into it because it was so therapeutic, and you can have fun with it. So I feel like it's very much a personal, just journey.
I think that idea of a personal journey, and I think the idea of the joy of drawing is a lovely place to stop.
Yeah.
And I would actually like to pick up on one more comment that you made, Marshall, about... should I say that all again? So I think that talking about the joy of drawing and talking about personal expression is a lovely place to end. And certainly I would encourage everyone to draw as well. I think it's just a fantastic way to understand the world. And I would like to pick up on one more thing that Marshall said, which is how we are rewarded for our attention. So I hope that you have all felt rewarded for your attention. And we want to thank you all for coming. And we want to thank all of the panelists and everyone at NYSED that made this possible. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Wow, that was very, very engaging. Yes.
We went all over the place.
Very much well done.
Yes.
Oh,
What
yes.
Listen,